Hey you guys, what's up? And welcome to Bird Burger, where we talk about all things wildlife and nature oriented. And today we're talking about the highly controversial topic of ethics in wildlife photography and how that affects us as a wildlife photography culture and the world around. And we're joined today by Matt Gould, a huge inspiration to me personally on this topic. Hey Matt, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. That was a very lovely introduction. Thank you.
Working on it. You're the first podcast we were ever putting up on this channel, and you deserve a good introduction. So
Really? Oh, sick. No, I'll tell you that. That's sick.
So 3 months ago, you released a video on baiting in wildlife photography, and it was really impactful for me. I don't know about anyone else, but for me, it was pretty life-changing on like my perspective of just how I view our culture and how we respond to baiting, but also on baiting itself. For those who haven't watched this video, can you give them kind of like a quick summary of what you kind of talk about in that video and what you're kind of going through in terms of that conversation?
It's baiting's like an interesting one. So I think there's so many highly charged opinions around it, and as I get older, I realise my opinions change quite a lot on a variety of things, and I wanted to make a video covering something that I'd always knew as being very controversial, just from speaking to friends and things like that. And I guess this video sort of explores the fact that lots of people have lots of different opinions on the subject of baiting, but it's a more nuanced subject than what we sometimes give it credit for.
Yeah, like we talk about it in such black and white terms a lot. And that was one of the things I appreciated was like your concept of kind of like this grayscale area. There's so many different varieties of baiting, intensities of baiting, and there's so many different experiences that are feeding into that, right? I really liked something that stood out to me was your idea of like, it's talked about quite a bit, right? But maybe for some of us who don't know, the difference of like intensive versus light baiting, right? Intensive being that repetitive type of baiting versus light being just a one time. What are those differences on the impact that these different types of baiting have, and why is it that people get upset about this in the first place?
I think for a lot of people, like I say, a lot of people have a different line, have their lines drawn in different places. But for me, one of the big ones is whether you change an animal's behaviour. So if it's, for example, a scavenging species or a foraging species, and you happen to leave something that it could naturally find, just to maybe veer it off course ever so slightly on its feeding pattern to set up for the right shot for you, for example, a bird on a perch that's foraging through the gardens, going to different feeders, and then you have a little one set up for your photography, that seems fine. But if you're out in the absolute wild and you find a site that you're going to go to every week and provide food for it every week, for a carnivore, for example, let's say a wolf, for example, if you're going to be providing meat for it for, let's say, 4 or 5 months every week on a regular pattern where it gets used to it and starts to depend on that, and then you take it away, that's where people get a bit... completely understandably, to be fair, that's where people get upset about it, because you're changing the behavior from what is considered natural.
Another problem that we find a lot in wildlife photography and wildlife photography ethics is just the approach of the bird even, right? So you talk a lot in that video about baiting, but there's also this idea of how much do you disturb the bird as a wildlife photographer when you're out in nature, approaching it and all that stuff. What's kind of your take on that, or what's kind of your experience that you've seen in that and how that affects wildlife?
So for me, a good wildlife photographer should only observe. Where possible. I guess the baiting thing is part of that argument where that starts to become a blurred line. But for me, if I'm approaching an animal like a bird, for example, then my line has always been I failed and I will leave if the bird changes its behaviour because of my presence. So if it stops what it's doing and is then focusing on me, or it starts to switch to an alarm call, or it has to move away from the spot that it was, then that's my time to sort of exit and consider it a failure, and I'm done now. The exception being if it sees you, because sometimes you'll have wildlife see you, wait to sort of assess that if you're a threat or not, and then continue with what it's doing. I think that's all right, because that's just natural. It'll do that with anything that comes past. It has to work out whether anything is a threat, and that for me is okay. But if it, as a result of seeing you, changes its behaviour, I think that's probably my line, and which hasn't really changed from when I started, to be honest. I just feel you should always just be observing as a photographer.
Yeah, most definitely. You're witnessing nature in its habitat, its environment, right? What's kind of like the way that you go about that practically then? Can you share a little bit about that in the way of like, because for example, like, you know, there's so many different ways that you can go about wildlife photography, whether that's, you know, approaching and you know, following, you know, let's just say it's a bird and following it until it's just exhausted, right? And just keep following as it keeps flying away from you, right? Or there's ways where, you can, you know, just camp out somewhere hidden for, you know, hours or days. What's kind of your best approach to wildlife photography, knowing that you have kind of these boundaries and these lines you won't cross then?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two ways to do wildlife photography, two very broadly speaking. So I work in a camera shop part time, and if someone's looking to get into photography, one of the first things I ask is, how does it fit into their life as a hobby? How do they do it? Do they dedicate a day to the photography, or is photography secondary to a walk, for example? And I think there's two aspects, and there's one where people will take a lightweight setup and they'll walk and take photos as they go, and that's very opportunistic, and that's where you're going to come into the, more often than not, the issue of disturbance as you approach an animal. And then there's other people that the first set of people may one day end up being, which is where you can dedicate a whole day to it, and you go out and you learn about the animal, you learn where it's likely to be and when, and you sit and you wait. And in my experience, further into the hobby I've got, that's 9 times out of 10 what I do now is I'll find a spot that I know there's activity, and I'll go and sit and I'll wait, because wildlife coming to you is going to offer you a much better shot, because it's so much more comfortable with your presence, because it's the one making the forward moves. It doesn't see you as a threat if you're just sat there, and it might not just see you at all if you're just sat there. So I think there's definitely two ways to partake in wildlife photography, and for me, I fall more into the realms of the sit and wait is what I'd call it now. But yeah, I think you can definitely, without causing any disturbance to the wildlife or causing any issues, you can definitely do the walking around thing. You've just got to maybe be much more self-aware of what you're doing, and maybe don't get pulled into needing to get the shot. It's better to leave the animal there to be photographed another day than to push it so far to the point of starvation. Yeah,
most definitely. That's a great point. I mean, to be honest, in my because I come from a photography background before I got into wildlife photography and birding and all that stuff. And yeah, like in my early days, I had a literal lack of knowledge of like, this is actually harming the species that I'm going after. Because when I got into it actually in Costa Rica, very like on my own. There was no one that was guiding me, and at the time I wasn't following anyone that was talking about any of this stuff. And so I would just, you know, keep running after the animal species.
Well, that's the thing. Like, this is what I tried to cover in the video, because like, with all due respect, you just didn't know at that time, right? Like, it doesn't mean that you didn't have the same capacity to care the same as someone who's been heavily involved in wildlife photography for like 20 years. Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, those people who have been would see someone like yourself and instantly go on the warpath. And you're like, no, that could just be someone's early experiences with it, and they just don't know. Like, it's... Yeah. You can have a polite conversation about it and be like, look, it's great to see you're interested, but this is kind of damaging in a certain way, and do you know what I mean? I think we often only ever see things from the level that we're currently at. We don't take into account that someone could know more, and we don't take into account that someone could just know less and be at the exact same level we were at. Do you know what I mean? Like, but knowledge is such a weird thing. Like, the photo behind me is a dragonfly laying eggs. But I did that with a 100 to 400 and a 70D. And I was leading a kids' introductory to photography group, and it was just this big old pond. And I was trying to sort of talk to the kids, but they got to the point where attention spans had waned, and they were just running around with the cameras. And that's fine; they're enjoying it. Do you know what I mean? Do your thing. And they were chasing this dragonfly, not disturbing it, because of course they couldn't go in the water, but they were running around the edge of the pond. Yeah. And I worked out that because I spent a lot of time around them, and because I had the knowledge at that time, and I definitely wouldn't have at their age, I worked out that they the dragonfly was circling an area that I was thinking it was likely to land and do this. So I went and laid down next to it for half an hour and waited for it to land rather than joining the mobs chasing. Do you know what I mean? And it just comes down to knowledge. It's all it is. And it's not me being like, oh, I know more and this, that and the other. It's a case of, at that time, I had the right knowledge of the species. Do you know what I mean? That's all it is. And had I been their age, I wouldn't have. And so I would have done exactly the same and run around and chase. Do you know what I mean? But it's a weird one how we judge based on that, I have to say.
Yeah, most definitely. There's such like a knowledge involved with needing to know your species and stuff like that. Like I've had two really great encounters with like a great egret and a great blue heron before this one location I go to. And typically, herons are some of the more skittish creatures, at least in this area. I don't know about where you are in the UK, but yeah, around here, it's like, I mean, usually you see one from a quarter mile away, and they're already on the edge if they're gonna flush or not. But occasionally I come past some that are very bold and very just like okay with it, right? And it's interesting for me always in those situations because it's so like you have to watch and observe so much their kind of like their behavior and their little characteristics that are telling you like, hey, you're stressing me out or not. Because in like two situations I've had before with herons and egrets where it was like they literally were like totally fine with me being there. I just got to like walk around with them and not like run directly at them, right? Because that definitely would have stressed them out and made them flush. But I got to just maneuver around them, slowly approach them, and they were totally fine with it, and just carried on with their hunting patterns.
There's a lot to be said for learning individual animals as well and things like that. I think, there's a lot of emphasis put on gear, and it helps, but there's far more to wildlife photography than just gear. But it's interesting what you say about comparing species across the pond, so to speak, because I got a fair bit of backlash from the video from people who saw my argument as the side of the argument that they didn't like for whatever reason. And weirdly, I got accused of being both sides. And I was like, dude. But what a lot of it came down to is they were angry. People in America were angry that I was encouraging foxes, and what it boiled down to after I got a discussion going about it is that they had experience with coyotes, and foxes are. I'm not saying you have foxes over there, don't you? But they're a slightly different subspecies. But the ones that I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the ones that most often are seen in cities are coyotes.
In our area, I would, at least in California where I live.
So I can't remember what area of America this was, but there was a couple of people that said about this, and interestingly, it's because they were associating what I was doing with their knowledge of that species, which just happened to be similar. But in terms of temperament, they're so different. Looking into it, like foxes are so timid. They are like the shyest, like. They are head down, keep going kind of animal. And then the coyotes, from what I hear, are quite bold. And there's been several instances of biting and things like that. And with foxes, it's very rare. Like, the amount that we have in our cities, like, regular occasions, I'll look out my window and there's a family of foxes just playing. Like, they're everywhere in the city. You can't... it's really, really bizarre. They are just everywhere in every city, but they're so timid, and as soon as they hear a movement or anything like that, they disappear into the bushes, and they just don't really want to know you. They just want to stay out your way, and it was very interesting getting the backlash from someone who'd associated them with the species that they knew, and maybe hadn't taken into consideration that it may have a completely different experience with a different species in a different country. It was just from their perspective. And I found that quite interesting, just from what you were saying about the comparison of herons.
Yep.
But, it was a weird learning curve, that one.
Yeah, most definitely. That's so good. Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because you've already kind of brought it up. Actually, I'm gonna quote something out of your video first, and then we're gonna talk about it.
Okay. I'm getting quoted. Here we go.
Here we go. Quoted now.
Oh no.
Yeah, no, I really love. There's this part in your video, about halfway through, where you go on kind of like this monologue, talking about kind of starting out with the idea of the capacity to care that you talked about earlier. So just to read that quote, I want to read quite a bit of it because it was really good. It says, rarely do we, and we talking about as wildlife photographers, even stop to think that everyone involved may have the exact same potential capacity to care for the wildlife. Although our intentions may be good, we often forget when and how our love for the natural world may have started. I think this is also in part due to the very reactionary cancel culture world that we now live in. So it's perhaps too easily forgotten that the sheer joy of a first encounter with a wild animal that's so endearingly obvious in children can be experienced at any age, but manifests itself in a way that just isn't as visible. Then you go on to say, in my personal experience, the desire to do what's best for the wildlife, which leads to the learning about ethics and your own impacts, rarely happens without having moments like this. And when it does, there's so much to learn and experience over so many years with so many variables at play. It's no wonder why people have different levels of understanding as a result and conflicting opinions about where to draw the line. I love that quote so much. That was just beautifully crafted. I don't know if that was just a pure stroke of genius that wound up coming up, or a lot of labor and hours.
I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that because I spent so long trying to word that. Because it's like I knew what I wanted to say, but it's like it's so hard not to fall into that reactionary cancel culture world when trying to put that point across. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, no, I appreciate it.
Exactly. I love how you said that. I love how there's still a concern and care for the wildlife photography, but it's recognizing that there's a larger picture as a whole. Can we talk a little bit about just what is it more important to value? Like, what should be valued higher? People's care in the first place, or the ethics in terms of their action? And I think what I'm trying to say here, if that's not quite clear, is like, right, as a wildlife photography culture, sometimes we can be very cancel culture in only talking about the action. Like, you did this is wrong, you should not be doing this. But if the person doesn't care in the first place, or the person doesn't know in the first place, how are they expected to be able to process and like be able to handle that, right? So would you mind sharing a little bit just about kind of that idea and the difference between like getting people to care in the first place and then also like the actions and the actual ethics at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, I think care is what matters most. I think intent before the action is what matters most, and you get that most within the cancel culture thing. I'm not a big fan of cancel culture. I know there's a lot of people that consider it the calling out of things that shouldn't be happening, and 9 times out of 10 that is exactly what it's doing. But I think the way in which it's so extreme and so aggressive doesn't leave room for learning and self-growth.
Wow.
And I think unfortunately a lot of that is, I think, youth. So like, I'm 28 and I, depending on how you look at it, I'd still consider myself young. But as I get older, I am starting to look at the world differently, and I imagine I'll continue to go down that thought process as I get older still, in that people can still be good people and make mistakes, and part of life is learning, and one of the best ways to do that is through mistakes, right? Like it's and to have an attitude of, no, it's black, it's white. Do you know what I mean? This is how we do it. Very much is something that I was guilty of. You go back like 10 years ago, and I think a lot of the reactionary cancel culture type stuff comes from not being able to see past the actions that are sometimes blindly associated with the level of care. Does that make sense? So like if you're going pond dipping, have you ever? I don't know if that's a phrase used. Yeah. So pond dipping in the UK is like a big thing, and I think it was one of my early experiences. Was we built a pond in my garden, and my mum was very much into getting me to embrace the natural world, sort of thing. She taught me to ride. She was very into horses and things like that, and so we, in our little garden, we built this tiny little pond, but it got full of frogs really quickly, and my early years were spent in the pond, effectively, like grabbing the frogs and like getting close to them, and didn't hurt one of them, but I shouldn't really have been picking them up. But that was an experience that I really think sparked a lot of the path that I went down. And I think if I was to do that today, on my channel, for example. If I filmed a video on ponds and I walked up to a pond and was like, here's a frog, like, and grabbed it out, people would instantly be like that. And I think that's damaging, because okay, yeah, call someone out, but do it maybe in a less aggressive way. Maybe do it in a suggesting what could be done, rather than you shouldn't do this and so this should happen to you.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? Maybe be like, perhaps don't do this, perhaps do this instead because of this reason.
Yeah.
It's a much better, do you know what I mean? I think it's a maybe just a softer touch. And I think, yeah, if we just, for me, what you intend matters far more. If someone's intending to show off frogs, for example, in that scenario, and be like, oh, look how cool they are, that's what matters most. Just be like, let's maybe do it in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
let's try it this way. And so for me, yeah, the intent and the care and the passion behind something is what matters most, not necessarily the actions. And don't get me wrong, I still get very annoyed at some people's actions, but you have to have room to grow.
Yeah.
Right? You have to be allowed to grow.
It's such an integral part of your story, almost, in a way. As I hear you explain that, like, it sounds like that might have been one of the things that pushed you into that care for nature, right? And if you didn't have that, you wouldn't be the person you are, who cares about nature enough to be able to have these boundaries and these ethics currently. So that's so incredible. Like, if someone would have left that experience you had as a kid with a bad taste in your mouth and left it there, kind of in a way where it's like, very angry and whatever towards you, maybe that would have deterred you into a way that would have left you in a completely different spot in your life in terms of caring.
100%. Yeah. 100%, because I'm quite anxiety, like, I have quite high anxiety, and if someone had, like, snapped at me for that, and I had taken a back seat, so to speak, and not done it at all, there's very little hands-on experiences available in British wildlife. And I think that can be such a strong catalyst, as you say. So, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, at some level, I think it's really interesting to think about the concept of, at some level, we're all impacting the planet in some way, shape, or form. And you actually talk a little bit about that near the end of kind of like that monologue or that dialogue that I was talking about. You don't get too deep into it, but you briefly mention it. At some level, just the mere fact of being human beings in the current civilization and culture that we live in on this planet, you're making some sort of a negative impact on Mother Nature. And so I think it's really interesting to think about, okay, what is the line? And even when I think about doing wildlife photography, if you were like the most purest of a pure person, probably actually doing any sort of wildlife photography is in some way impactful, right? Towards the wildlife that you're looking at and photographing. Like, if really it was like a 100% like, I will not affect them, you wouldn't even be out there in the first place, because there's no chance of that. Because even as good as our intentions are, there's going to be some situations where like I've made something flush, and it's not because I was like trying to do it and chasing it down, or just kept creeping up on it when it was like, when I'm like 5 feet away from the nest. It's not because of that, but just like some situations where you're gonna bother them, you're going to accidentally make something flush or disturb its eating pattern or hunting behavior. So I think it's really interesting to think about that as a line, and I really like how you've talked about that as like as this kind of like grayscale area of where it's like we need to care, we need to be conscious of our ethics and our actions and what we're doing, but it's really hard when the first thing that we want to do and respond with is shouting, when maybe we don't even know that situation fully, and we don't know that wildlife photographer that got into this situation, or whatever it may be. To get into one last question before we close out, I really like just leading into it though, talking about that really quick. I think a lot about the idea of like having a North Star, right? And how do you speak to someone who doesn't have the same North Star as you? Like, going back to just the topic of ethics and wildlife photography, if this person doesn't have the same North Star, if they don't care and are pointed in the direction of caring for nature or the environment in the first place, like how are you ever going to be able to talk to them and convince them otherwise? And I think that's one of the hard parts about cancel culture, is that it doesn't address the idea of their North Star is actually probably different than your North Star, right? It's assuming that their North Star is the same, and then it's trying to kind of like force them into a different course of action accordingly. But in reality, we had to do so much to change or like work in a conversation to like, hey, how can we align our North Stars to make sure we're caring about the same thing? And then accordingly, typically more than not, the actions will wind up kind of magnetizing and gravitating towards it, right? As you were getting ready to release this video, was there any sort of like a timidness about making this video in terms of the backlash that you thought or knew you were probably going to get from it?
No, weirdly. I wouldn't describe it as timidness. Nervousness, yes. But I'm very stubborn is maybe one word that would be used to describe me. And when I started out this channel, going to your question, like, one, it was just a way for me to make a living doing what I love. And two, it was because I see social media and YouTube and things like that as being one of the ways of reaching people who don't yet care for wildlife, but maybe, as we've said, might have the capacity to.
Yep.
And like you say, possibly giving a chance to align those North Stars, as you say. But I think one of these videos, a video like this that just raises a question and shows something on the surface just cute and cool at the same time, and perhaps aspirational as a life experience, is one of those ways to encourage others to like ask more questions. And that's how you hook people in, is make people want to ask questions. Because that's curiosity, right? That's if you get someone that's curious about something, then you're in. Yeah, that's all it is. So when it came to releasing it, I wasn't timid, no, because I knew this could be a chance to do, well, basically what you've reached out because of the video, right? So it's exactly the point I was making. Even though we both had the same sort of mindset, there'll be people that then watch this as a result and hadn't considered about ethics or things like that, and so I knew or had faith in the fact that it would at least cause some people to raise questions to themselves, because in 10 years' time I will look back and think, oh, I need to ask questions of how I made that video, perhaps. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think if you go into something openly asking a question, you're maybe a little protected. You're not as in the wrong, because you're not saying, I know this is how it is, you do this, you do that. You're saying perhaps this, which is a whole different thing, and then people can talk about it. And so I wasn't timid about it at all, but I was braced, should we say, for the impact that did definitely follow. There was a whole heap of messages, I tell you. I mean, a lot of them were public, to be fair. A lot of them did say in the comments, but it is very interesting, because a lot of them very aggressive first message, and by the end we're apologising. It was really weird just to have a conversation.
That's powerful.
I think we have this shield of, I think I call it shield of anonymity that is online, and so you go in feeling brave and strong, like road rage, when you're protected by like a metal shield around your car, and you're nice and safe. You can be really angry, and then when someone goes to open your door, all of a sudden you're quite quite easy to talk to all of a sudden. But I think it's the same. I wasn't timid, like I say, but I was aware that there was about to be a lot come my way, and I was going to be on my phone communicating quite a lot for quite a while, and it went on for about a week. So I'm happy I did it.
Sure. I've definitely moved into an approach. Thanks so much for sharing that. I've moved into an approach where it's like, if there's anything that I have to say that could potentially harm, hurt, or negatively impact someone in, my response to them or my comment, I've just come to a place where it's like, this is not something that I'm going to publicly share. It's always become something of a direct message or, a call or something like that. So like, even like, I don't know, that was maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago, not exactly on the stuff that we're talking about, but I hit up a wildlife photographer that I knew about something that he was I just felt like he needed kind of like a check-in, and I hit him up personally. I wasn't gonna like, I care about this guy. I want him to thrive. I want him to succeed. And I hit him up personally, and I was like, hey man, I saw your perspective on this, but I don't think that was quite right. Like, and I hit him up personally because I don't think that shouting that into the world and having everyone humiliate and shame him is going to do any sort of good for him, or the world around us.
Completely. If you could, I called someone out the other day, a friend of mine who posted about, but again, it was just knowledge. It was just, she took it down immediately. I was like, I really don't want to seem like I'm being a bit of a git here. Like, I don't want, I'm not, but I have to say that the thing that you're saying is amazing. Probably resulted in the injury to that bird, or has done to a lot of birds. And it was plunge pools with kingfishers. I don't know if you know about that. So often they'll set up like to make it look as if the shot's from underwater, but often the water will be too shallow, and they'll often hit their beaks, and there's all sorts of horrible things. And so I just pointed that out. She was like, "Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god!" And like you say, like just open communication, right? Like if you're open about it, people will speak and discuss, and it doesn't always have to be anger. It doesn't. It's bizarre, but no, good on you, man, for hitting that person up, but doing it in a productive way. Is most
definitely. Thanks so much, Matt, for being here, and I appreciate having you on this channel, and being the first, having the honor of the first podcast that we're going to be, working through for this Bird Burger channel. That's really
number one.
Number one. That's really like, I mean, that's the goal of this channel, right? Is as we're moving forward, just to make it a place where we can be friendly, open, and it's not elitist, it's not exclusive, but it's rather this conversation that we're having with community. That way, hopefully, we can even reach into populations that are not currently already wildlife nerds and obsessed with nature and stuff like that.
Yes.
So I love it.
Yes, embrace the inner nerd. That's what we want to do. We want to get more people embracing the inner nerd. That's it.
Any cool things you're working on right now?
So I've sold my 500mm f4, my big wildlife lens. And I'm shifting slightly into video. So I'm sticking with stills, but in order to make it pay and improve my my channel, I'm going to be shifting into video. And for the next 3 months, we'll be building a wildlife show reel. And so if you want to see some hopefully interesting footage and stills to go along with it, I'll be producing loads over the next 3 months, right up to the end of March. And then at the end of it, you'll see a finished product of a show reel, which I'm gonna make as a little mini series, which could be quite interesting. And then I've got some other things in the pipeline, but I'll keep those under wraps for now. Just make sure you follow the channel and turn on notifications for this one as well, of course.
Definitely over here first. If you're not over here, don't even head over there.
100%.
No.
100, one at a time. Do this one first, prioritize this one, and then hop over to mine.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yeah, make sure to check out his channel, link below in the description. And it was great having a conversation with you. Thank you so much for coming on.